Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for What's My Lab Do? This is our spring quarter with David Menendez, and yeah, we're excited to get started. My name is Palash. I'm going to be your facilitator today. I am one of the lead peer advisors for the psychology department, and I am currently a senior.
And hi, y'all. My name is Paige. I may have met with some of y'all at some point. I'm one of our psychology undergraduate advisors, and I'm just here kind of for technical support. Um, and I'll kind of just be in the background, but thank you all for joining us.
And yeah, so our professor that we're doing What's My Lab Do with for this quarter is going to be Professor David Menendez. He's an assistant professor here at UCSC, and he studies cognitive development, culture and cognition, STEM education, conceptual development, and biology learning. And he also looks after the CRECE lab, which is cognition, representation, education, culture, and environment. And Professor, if you want to go for it, I'd like to hand it off to you.
All right, sounds good. Let me share my screen. Also, hi all. Hey, nice to meet you all. Um, Posh, and you might need to stop sharing your screen. All right, great. So, I'm Professor David Menendez. I'm a new assistant professor in the Department of Psychology here at UC Santa Cruz. I started just this fall, so this is still my first year, so still trying to adjust to everything. And yeah, I wanted to start today by telling you a little bit about me and sort of my background. Some of you might know me from different classes. I taught Psych 2 in the fall, and I'm teaching a senior seminar right now. And recognize some familiar names. So this might be repetition, but you know, I think it's still good. Like I said, Professor Menendez, pronouns he, him, or and in Spanish. This is my office. My office hours are sort of open to everyone, so that is an option if you want to follow up after today. Uh, a little bit about me. I grew up in Colombia, the country, specifically in the city of Medellin, which is right around here. If you've never seen a map of Colombia before, a great city, love living there. A This is a picture of me as a little kid with my little booties because this picture is cute. And part of what I do is I study children and children development. So, it's always good to throw in a picture of when you were a kid. Uh, After I finished high school, I moved to the United States and I first moved to Florida, where I started at Miami-Dade College. So I started at a community college, did 2 years there, so got my associate's degree in psychology. And then when I was trying to figure out where to transfer, uh, that whole process was very complicated. And I ended up in the University of Wisconsin. I thought I would try it out for 2 years. It was a really big change, super drastic shift in where I was living. Uh, and I got my bachelor's in psychology there. So if anybody wants to talk about transfer student uh, issues or experiences, happy to chat about that. But I ended up loving Wisconsin. So I briefly then worked at the National Institute of Psychiatry in Mexico City, Ramon de la Fuente Muñez. I was doing work related to adolescent suicide back there. And I realized that that is not what I wanted to do with my life. I thought I wanted to be a clinician. And after a couple of months, I was like, this is a great experience, but this is too heavy and not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I went back to Wisconsin and I got my master's and my PhD in psychology. And that is also where I started being more interested in education. And I got a graduate minor in quantitative methods in education sciences. This is a picture of my PhD graduation. I'm a first generation college student, so the fact that I got a PhD is something that I'm super proud of. So all my family came from sort of all over to sort of celebrate with me. After that, I went to University of Michigan, where I was doing a postdoc. So I was basically just paid to do research for an entire year. I wasn't teaching, I was just focusing on research. And I started doing some work on how children think about illness, especially COVID, and how we can teach them about illness. And then after a year there, I moved to Santa Cruz, where I started this fall. And once I moved to Santa Cruz, I started the Crece Lab. A Crece is the Spanish word for grow, which kind of fits for a developmental psychology lab, but it also stands for all the things that I really care about. So a cognition, so how people think, a representation, education, culture, and then the environment in which children are growing up, but also thinking about sort of environmental issues. A The students in my lab ended up being super artistic, so they have made a bunch of different logos for the lab that sort of show everything that we study. So these were created. This is by an undergraduate student here at UCSC, Jasmine Barragan. And then this is by my grad student, Engiki Santos. So yeah, that is just a little bit about me. And what the main questions that I'm interested in sort of can be captured in sort of like a very, very long question, which is how do people understand, learn, generalize, and communicate about STEM concepts? And all of this is sort of based on the idea that understanding biological concepts and STEM concepts more broadly is important for everyday life. So recent technological innovations and scientific discoveries, like, for example, at-home genetic testing, the discovery of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and even recommendations for how to stay safe during a pandemic have sort of a broad, complex scientific concepts like genetic inheritance, evolution. Oh, I think is my computer frozen? Oh, there. And evolution and illness contagion to the forefront of our minds. And what this one means is that people nowadays need to have more scientific knowledge at a younger age in order to understand the world around them, right? If you're trying to think about why vaccines work or why do you need to like finish your doses of like antibiotics when you're given them by doctors, or you're trying to interpret your like 23andMe, a really big part of that is sort of knowing what those concepts means and what is the background behind them. Right? And this might seem very educational, but sort of issues of how children think and learn are central to children's cognitive development, which is my role here in the psychology department. And I like to think of how we actually learn these concepts as something that we don't only learn in schools. So there are many different learning contexts that actually help us understand the world around. So, for example, you could learn through direct experiences. So maybe you are interacting with the world around you. Maybe you find a new bug and you sort of like learn about things like insects. You could learn through interacting with others, having conversations with more knowledgeable people like teachers, parents. And so they talk to you about things that you might not be able to see or might not be able to interact with. And then finally, like formal instruction. So when you go to school, when you read a book, when you watch crash course YouTube video, what you're sort of doing is you sort of getting communicated about these concepts, and the way that we might be representing those concepts or talking about them might actually be influencing how you learn. And so the big puzzle that interests me is this idea that regardless of all these learning concepts, you need to decide how far you're going to extend the knowledge that you just got to different circumstances. So if you just interacted with this bug over here, then you need to decide, okay, to what other bugs does this information apply to? If you just learn, for example, something about vegetables when you're cooking with your family, you need to see, okay, how broadly does that generalize to other foods? And let's say if you're in elementary school and you just learned something about squares, you need to determine, okay, how does that extend to other squares or other geometrical shapes? So, sort of put another way, regardless of the context, you sort of have to infer when it is appropriate for you to generalize what you just learned in order to apply it to a new circumstances, and when it is actually might not be appropriate for you to extend this knowledge. So in my work, I look at this in a ton of different content areas. So, for example, I look at how children think about death, specifically, how do talking with parents or participating in cultural rituals. So, things like participating in Dia de los Muertos, which is a celebration in a lot of regions in Mexico where the dead are believed to come back to the land of the living for either a day or 5 days, depending on the specific region in Mexico. And you're supposed to be able to interact with them. You set up ofrendas or altars for them, and they're supposed to be able to consume the food that is put out for them. So how does participating in that cultural ritual might actually influence the way that children think about death? Like I was saying earlier, I also looked at how children think about illness. So I have designed different children's books. So here's one example of one that I created last year to teach children about the concept of illness, specifically COVID. So right now we're sort of testing whether that book actually helps children learn. And then we're gonna make it freely available to parents so they can use it to explain illness to children. I've also looked at how parents and teachers talk about illness and how they convey both biological information, but then also other types of information like when parents say like, oh, like you need to wear a sweater because it's cold outside and you're gonna get sick, or when parents say things like, oh, like don't sleep with your hair wet because that's gonna make you sick. So how do parents convey both biological, but then also these non-biological ways of thinking about illness? I've looked at nutrition and how parents decide what foods are nutritious for their kids and whether they actually pay attention to nutritional information or they just kind of just go on vibes, what they like know from before, what they grew up eating, and so use that information to decide what to eat. I've looked at how people at different ages think about genetic inheritance and how we can actually teach genetics in a more intuitive way to children. I've looked at evolution and how we can actually teach evolution to elementary school students and how when you do that, both parents and children understand evolution better. How children think about lifespan changes, or how do they think about, for example, ladybugs going through metamorphosis. Something that a lot of undergraduate students don't know is that all insects go through metamorphosis. So how can we actually teach that concept so they actually generalize it? And then also I've looked a little bit at some mathematical concepts like constant change or mathematical equivalence, and looking at some of the common mistakes that students make and what are the cognitive factors that actually make those mistakes predictable. How can we actually get students to change the way that they solve problems? All right, so that is in very, very broad strokes, everything that I do, which is kind of all over the place. But so for today, I just want to kind of talk about a few of the studies looking at those three big themes of my research. So how do people understand some concepts? how do they learn and generalize them, and then how do they communicate about them. So first, to how people understand STEM concepts, I'm just going to give you one example of the type of study that my lab does to see if it sounds interesting. And that is going to be about genetic inheritance. So this study was with 4 to 12-year-old children, and we recruited 232 children and their parents from around the US. And what we did, among many other things, is that we would present them to parents of an animal family. So in this case, 2 foxes. This would be the mother, and this would be the father. And we would sort of present them with a bunch of different scenarios, ask kids a bunch of different questions about it. But one of the questions that we asked them was, this mom and dad had 6 babies over their lifetime, 3 males and 3 females. What do you think the babies would look like? So then we gave children different spaces for them to actually put physical cards that we gave to them. And the cards that we presented were like this. So one of the cards looked like the father. So they had, sorry, like the mother. So they had exactly the same eye color as the mother. One of them had exactly the same eye color as the father. One of them had an eye color that is in between the mother and the father. So this is a little bit darker than this eye color and a little bit lighter than this eye color. One of them had one eye color from each parent. And the last one sort of had an unrelated type of eye color, something that you don't really see in nature, something that you wouldn't get from either of the parents, which in this case was purple eyes. So we presented all 5 of these alternatives to kids. They had 6 spots, and we were just looking, okay, what did they select? How did they think that the babies would look like? And there's sort of no right or wrong answer. Like, you don't need to know the ways in which the genetic information gets combined, which one is recessive, which one is dominant, or anything like that. We're just seeing, okay, what do children expect? And what we see is, so here are the different types of offspring. So where they had dark eyes, light eyes, a blend, so either a mix of the 2 colors, so 1 eye of each color, or the purple eyes. And then whether they selected it for the female offspring or for the male offspring. So what we found was pretty interesting. So first, if you look at the purple bars, we see that children thought that the purple eyes were going to be more common for the female offsprings. And when we asked them why, a lot of kids were saying like, oh, like it's a pretty color or it's a girl color. And because of that, like the girls are going to have it. So even though gender doesn't really play a role in this, and even though this eye color is not possible, children are sort of using their ideas about gender to think about genetic inheritance. But what is even more interesting to me is that they selected the dark eyes for the female offsprings and then the light eyes for the male offsprings. And if you remember the previous slide, the mother had dark eyes and the father had light eyes. And we found this across studies, across groups of kids at all ages, and we also found it across different animals and different traits besides eye color. Basically, every single time that I run this study, we find that children, and also to the same extent, or to a similar extent, adults, and also undergraduate biology majors, think that female offsprings are more likely to resemble the mother, and male offsprings are more likely to resemble the father, which is something that is not biologically correct. There are many things that differ based on sex, but like eye color is not one of them for foxes or for humans. But like there's sort of this very big expectation that like offsprings are going to resemble the same-sex parent. So this new misconception that doesn't really seem to be based on any scientific evidence, and we find it very consistently, even across education levels, sort of showing that this is something that doesn't get corrected in schools, and something that you might actually need a more genetic instruction or a different type of genetic instruction to actually correct. So we do this sorts of studies where we present kids with different cards, with different scenarios, or we find sort of interesting ways to ask questions to 4-year-olds that like don't have a lot of language to sort of get at how are they understanding scientific concepts. So there's a case with genetic inheritance, but I've done similar things about death, about illness, about metamorphosis, and about evolution. And so that was sort of the first part of my work. I also look at how people learn and generalize STEM concepts. And the example that I want to give you from this is from my work on kids' understanding of illness. So in this study, I was sort of looking at whether 5 to 8-year-old children can learn about viruses at home. So we recruited 235 children and their parents from around the US. And what we did is that we brought them for an online Zoom session because this was done in pandemic times. And first, the children completed a pretest. We were looking to see how much do they know about viruses. And then they read a book with their parent about viruses. It was actually this same book. And the book could be either realistic, so sort of showing a very scientifically accurate way of portraying viruses. It could be anthropomorphic, where we sort of personify the virus. So we give it like legs and arms, and it is doing like a bunch of different things. So the virus is grabbing onto the cells. So this is an example here, which probably cannot see very well through Zoom, but just sort of treated more like a Disney character, something they might see in like TV shows or other books. Or we show them a control book that still talked about illness, but didn't really mention viruses. It just talked about like, oh, like sometimes you get symptoms and you feel sick, and like washing your hands can protect you against getting sick, but really didn't talk about viruses. Then we sent those books home with family. We sent those books home with the families, and they had an entire month to read the books as many times as they wanted. And then after an entire month, we brought the kids back in, again through Zoom, to see how much they learn from these situations. And what we find is that talking to children about viruses, so getting either the realistic or the anthropomorphic book, help children learn. So these are the post-test scores, and higher here means better. So they're getting more questions correct. And what we see is that in the control condition, which is this blue line, children at all ages sort of had a very similar score. They didn't really get better with age or anything like that. But children in the realistic and the anthropomorphic condition did better than children in the control, so their lines are higher. And also they increase with age. So older children were getting more information out of the book than the younger children, which is what you typically expect, that like a 9-year-old is going to know more about viruses and illness than a 5-year-old. Sort of showing that the way that you talk to children about viruses can actually help them learn information, and that this can actually be done at home without an experimenter. You just send books to families, and they actually read it to their kids, and the kids reported actually enjoying reading the books with their parents. Then we also saw whether they actually extended this information to a new virus. So we introduced them to a taseo virus, which was a newly discovered virus by scientists that is making people sick. And we actually saw whether they actually generalized this. And we see sort of very similar levels, but again, if they got either the anthropomorphic or the realistic book, children are actually generalizing a little bit more than if they got the control book. Sort of showing that they're not only able to learn, but they're also able to extend this to new situations, new viruses that they've never encountered before. So yeah, that just sort of shows that the way that we present information, the way that we show things might actually influence how kids learn and generalize STEM concepts. And I've done some more studies looking, for example, does it matter if we present color, and how does color actually influence the way that children or adults generalize information? Does it matter the language that we use? And does that actually help you think differently about things like mental illness? So just the way that we present information might actually influence the way that we think about it. And then the final sort of piece of my work is how do people communicate about STEM concepts? And for this one, I wanted to show you one of the studies that my lab is currently conducting right now. We started this study in April, so we are just sort of getting started. But in this study, my graduate student is interested in how do parents and children talk about death. So we currently have 12 children between the ages of 4 and 6, and we also have their parents. And we only have 12 right now because we just started, but our target is to have 60 families. And what we're having them do is that first we have a parent interview where we ask them things like, oh, do you talk to your children about death? Has your child ever had a death experience? We give them a bunch of questions that we are then going to ask their kids, and we ask them, how do you think your kid is going to answer these questions? Do you try to shield, do you prevent your kid from seeing movies or reading books that have death? So there's some families that say like, oh yeah, like I don't let my kid watch The Lion King because I don't want them to see a Mufasa dying at the beginning. Then we actually bring their kids in and we ask them all those same questions. So we ask them, okay, do they understand death? Do they know that, things cannot come back to life? Do they know that all living things have to die? Do they know that like once you're dead, you cannot see things or you cannot hear things? Questions like that. Do they know what causes someone to die? We also asked them some more questions about life. So what actually makes something alive versus not? And then after all of that, then we have them watch a couple of little movies together. So we show them animated short films. And one of them is this a short film called One Small Step about this girl Luna who wants to be an astronaut. And then as she grows older, she struggles trying to be an astronaut. And then at one point in the movie, her father dies, and uh, it is not shown how the father dies, but you kind of sort of see her visiting your grave, and she gets really sad. And then finally, at the end of the movie, she gets to be an astronaut and goes to space, and so it has a really happy ending. But we were interested in whether children would actually talk about these with their parents. So after they watch the movie, we sort of show them a couple of questions, and we were like, okay, like talk about this however you want. Here are 4 questions. Talk about at least 3 of them. Only one of the questions is about death, so parents could like not mention it at all, just like skip it, or they could actually sort of bring the topic to their kids. And here is a video of something that is happening with the participants. Let me see. Let me stop sharing for a second, and then optimize for video playing. But cool, sorry. Right, so hopefully you'll be able to hear it. So it's only about a minute.
Yeah, she really wanted to be an astronaut. Who was helping her with that? Do you know?
Who?
Her daddy was helping her. Yeah. He was fixing her shoes and making sure she had healthy food to eat. And then what happened to her daddy?
The daddy died.
Why did you think he died?
Because when he was making the shoes, he hammered himself.
Oh, that's why he got ouchied?
Yeah.
And that's why he died?
Yeah.
I think he was getting older too. Older and older. We didn't actually see how he died. He could have been sick. Or maybe he got a bigger ouchie.
Oh, maybe I think that's why. Because right after the ham, I think that then boom.
Just right after he hammered his hand,
Yeah.
boom, he got sick and he died.
Yeah, right after we said that fucking
Yeah,
hammered himself, that's when he died.
maybe.
All right. So that is just one example of what some of the families are in the study are actually doing. In this one, you see that the mom of the child really was talking about death and really sort of wanted to discuss the topic with the kid. The kid sort of had an idea of that the father had died in the movie, had an idea as to why, and they were just having a conversation about it. But this really varies by families. Some of the families that we bring into the study don't really talk about it at all. They just watch the movie, move on, no discussion about it. Some of the families, you have the kid actually be the one that is prompting the families or the parent to talk about death. So you see kids like, oh, saying like, oh, like what happened? What happened to the dad? Why did he die? But you don't really get parents giving a lot of responses. So they say something like, oh, don't worry about it. It's just a movie. So there's a lot of variety here. So what we're trying to understand is what sort of brings that variety. So is it that some kids understand death more, so their parents are more comfortable talking about it? Is it maybe a belief of the parent, like maybe the parent thinks that their kids are not old enough to understand it, so they don't talk to their kids about it? Could there be something else that we are not seeing that might actually be the reason why? So families differ with respect to this. And also, when parents and children actually talk about death, what do they actually mention? So you can see this family talked a lot about the reasons why somebody dies. They talked about getting old, they talked about ouchies or like accidents. But some families also bring other topics, like they might mention religion, they might mention how somebody feels and how do you feel when somebody dies. Some of them mention the different rituals. So they mention like for example, like, oh, do you think they had a funeral? And many of them will bring their own personal experience. So we had a family that the parent asked the child, like, oh, remember when my mom died, and remember like what we did when that happened. So sort of bringing their own personal experience when they're discussing these movies. All of this sort of suggestion that parents do, or at least sometimes do, talk to their children about death, and that these little animated films might actually serve as a context for parents can talk about death with their kids, for a death that might not be very um, emotional for the kids. It's a character that they don't know really well. It's not like an actual living person. But yeah, so that is currently what we are one of the studies that we have going on in my lab. And then
Yeah.
sort of going back, just to like recap everything. So my lab is sort of interested in how people think, learn generalized STEM concepts. How can we modify the information in educational materials and lessons, in the way that we talk to help children learn these concepts, and how might this vary depending on culture? So do families that uh, have different types of upbringing differ in all these factors? So that is all that I had prepared for today. Thank you so much for uh, showing up and listening to me and being interested in what I do. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Let me just share my screen so we can set up a Q&A really quick. Yeah. Yeah, so if anyone, so we'd like to start our Q&A. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question to the professor, please just drop a question into the chat. But in the meantime, while people do ask or think of their questions, Professor, I'd like to also ask you, what would probably be your favorite part of research, or what's a day like in your lab or for your research?
All right. A day in my lab kind of has like two parts. One is during the day. So that is mostly working on transcription. So a lot of the questions that we ask kids don't have just yes or no answers. Kids are explaining why they think that, things like that. So we have to get those videos and then transcribe, write everything that the kid is saying, and then actually code that. So for example, in that video that I showed at the end, we would go through that and be like, oh, they're talking about the causes of death here. Oh, they're talking about religious experiences here. So doing so that part of qualitative analysis. And then in the afternoons, so mostly between 3 p.m. to 7 p.m., that's when we actually do a lot of the research with the kids. So because most of my work is with kids who are in school or in daycare or who parents are working, most of the times we bringing families to the lab, that happens in the afternoon or in the weekend. So then we have either Zoom or in-person sessions with families, where we do the different studies. So a lot of the afternoons is preparing for that. Sometimes we go to other places like children's museums or like the Watsonville Library to do projects in collaboration with other arts. So yeah, that is what like a typical research day is in my lab. My favorite part is interacting with students. So I love talking with undergrads and like talking about the research, talking about what we're doing, talking about like what I think is really cool, and seeing if they think that's really cool or if they have other ideas why they think it's cool. So that like mentoring part is something that I really really like. And when you work with kids, sometimes they just say like the weirdest things. And like that is always a highlight when you get like a kid that like just like has a lot of like either is being super silly or like you get like a kid that is like a dinosaur kid and just like starts talking to you about dinosaurs. Like that just like I love that. That's great.
Awesome. Thank you. And we actually do have a few questions in the chat. The first one would be, how do you recruit families for studies?
We take a couple different rounds. Lately, we have been using Facebook ads to get families that are don't live just like only in Santa Cruz or like around the university. We do we go to different farmers markets, we go to public libraries when they have events with kids, we go to different museums just to get the word out there. And then for some of the projects that are more sort of related to school, so when that project about genetic inheritance, I like send letters to the public schools, just letting families know about the study, and then some of the families would like write back and say that they were interested in doing the study. So there's always sort of a mix, but those are sort of the main ways that we use to get families.
Okay. And we do actually have another question as well, which is, someone asked, they've been set on taking a clinical route as well, but I've been drifting a little more towards research. So how would you recommend experiencing both and making a decision on what's a good fit for you?
Oh, great question.
Yeah.
My suggestion is to try both. So if you're interested in research, join a research lab and see if you like it. Um, from my experience, I tried working in a psychiatric institute. I also worked in a rehab and just like talked to the people that had more or have been in the company for longer, and I just saw if that is sort of what I wanted to do. And for me, I tried it, and after a month, I was like, this is not what I want to do. But for you, it might be different. So yeah, I'd say just take a role, a job, volunteer, like join any spaces that give you some insight into like research or the clinical side of psychology, and see if you're into it.
Um, yeah. Thank you. And we actually do have one more question, which is, in your lab, would the opportunity to work with children be there in the study?
Uh, Sorry, what this? So,
Will students have the opportunity to work with children in the study?
oh yeah.
Okay.
So how my lab works is that I have a 2-quarter commitment, and how that works is that across the 2 quarters, we're training you in how to interact with children, training you in the different protocols of the study, with the idea that after, 2 or maybe 3 quarters, you'll get to actually conduct the research with the kids, provided like all the training goes well. So, yeah, that is so like a standard thing that we do in at least my lab. We want to get people in front of kids and sort of get a people that experience. So yeah, it's pretty common for my lab for people to actually interact with kids.
Oh, and someone also asked, when hiring people for your lab, what are the biggest things you would look for? And how can someone who doesn't currently have a lot of experience in research make up for it with other things?
Oh, good. So in my lab, I actually prefer people that don't have experience with research. I try to give opportunities to people that might not have experiences before, uh, just to, give the opportunities to serve everybody. So research experience is not something that I particularly look for. What I really look for is someone who has experience working with kids. That could be in a professional setting. So like if you were a nanny, if maybe you're an education major and you have experience working with kids for that, or summer camps, things like that. Or also sort of more informal experiences. So a lot of the people in my lab are like, oh, I have younger siblings and I always took care of them, or I took care of my cousins, things like that, just because it really helps in training when like somebody knows how to interact with like a 4-year-old. That is actually very difficult to train. And then the other part is sort of having a genuine like interest in what I do. So, someone who when they send me an email about like wanting to join the lab, they have like read the website and they say like, oh, like I'm actually pretty interested in this part of what you do. And then I always have an sort of interview, or really it's just a conversation with the people who are interested in the lab. And then when we were talking, I'm like, okay, like, why are you interested in my lab? Like, there's a bunch of other developmental psychology labs on campus. There's a bunch of other psychology labs on campus. Like, why are you interested about this one? And I think having like a good answer for that, like having like a genuine interest, or like knowing why you're doing this, is sort of what I look for the most.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we don't have any more questions in the chat, so we can move on. Thank you for answering everyone's questions.
Of course.
And yeah, for current research opportunities that you could find from the psychology department, they will be posted on the bulletin board on the second floor of Social Sciences 2. And we also do have a page online on our department website where there will be research opportunities posted as well. And thank you. And I also want to say thank you, Professor Menendez, for hosting our What's My Lab Do for this quarter. And yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.